The Colosseum, Rome's great theater of blood and marvel, was raised as a monument to imperial power, a gift for the masses who cheered while emperors smiled from marble thrones. To the poets, it was an eternal triumph, the beating heart of an empire. But history, as Rome wrote it, chose to forget what the heart beat upon. The grand amphitheater that could swallow 50,000 souls was built not on stone alone, but on the backs of men whose names never reached the record. They were the nameless ones, slaves from distant wars, criminals pressed into labor, children grown in chains. And when the Colosseum was finished, when the cheers first shook its arches, those slaves did not walk free. They descended into the Hippodrome, the labyrinth beneath the arena floor, to spend their lives in darkness. Imagine the descent, torchlight licking damp walls, the stink of wet earth and sweat, the echo of wood groaning as ropes strained under the weight of beasts in cages. Here, beneath the sand where Rome's people feasted their eyes on slaughter, another city existed. A city of chains and whispers, of creaking pulleys and bruised hands, where the empire's grand illusions were built by human muscle. The crowds above saw miracles, a lion rising from the ground as if conjured by gods, whole forests springing up in moments, gladiators appearing from nowhere. But every miracle had a cost, and it was always paid by those Rome preferred not to see. Our story begins with one man, though he could be anyone. He has no name that Rome will remember. His name was taken when his homeland was taken, perhaps Judea, burned under Titus, perhaps Dacia, perhaps Gaul. It does not matter. Rome is not careful with details of the conquered. What matters is this: he works in the dark. Each day begins with the creak of the capstan. He and 30 others lean their shoulders into the timber, circling like oxen, their bodies bent under the weight of invisible power. Above, a trapdoor opens. A beast emerges. The crowd gasps. The emperor smiles. None of them will ever know the sound of his breath breaking in the shadows, the splinters in his shoulders, the way his wrists bleed from rope burn. The Colosseum was praised as Rome's greatest gift, panem et circenses, bread and circus. But whose bread? Whose circus? For the nameless ones, it was neither. Bread was rationed like pity, and circus was the work that killed them. They were the hidden machinery of Rome's grand deceit, the hands that turned violence into entertainment, death into rhythm. The poets praised the glory of gladiators, the courage of hunters, the benevolence of emperors who gave spectacles to the people. No one praised the slaves. They were not meant to be remembered. The Hippodrome was a dungeon alive with noise, the growls of starving beasts waiting to be unleashed, the clatter of chains, the calls of overseers barking orders. There was a code of sound here, an invisible language. 1 thud of wood to raise a platform, 2 to hold, 3 to drop. A whistle for handlers, a bell for hunters. If the signals failed, chaos came quickly. Sometimes the ropes broke, sometimes the cages jammed. Sometimes the beasts turned on the men before they reached the arena. Then the crowd above, oblivious, laughed at the extra commotion, thinking it part of the show. They never knew that, below their feet, men were dying to make the fiction real. Morning was for venaciones, the hunts. Exotic animals dragged across oceans and deserts, lions from Africa, bears from the Alps, tigers from Parthia, elephants from India, were starved, tormented, and then unleashed for the crowd's delight. The hunts were no hunts. They were executions staged for applause. The slaves of the Hippodrome were the true hunters, though never with weapons. They herded beasts into lifts, smeared blood on doors to lure them, jabbed spears through cage bars to stir rage. When the trapdoor opened, the crowd believed they witnessed a marvel of Rome's power. Only those in the dark knew the truth. It was power stolen from their own flesh. At midday came damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Prisoners, rebels, thieves, men and women, unlucky enough to anger Rome, paraded in costumes to act out twisted myths. Orpheus played his lyre until lions tore him apart. Icarus wore wings that could not fly. Danae, drowned in gold, turned into fire. The condemned were symbols, their death's theater, their agony just another meal for the crowd. And all the while, the slaves dragged bodies away, raked fresh sand, and prepared for the next spectacle. Afternoon belonged to gladiators. Some were volunteers, most were not. To the crowd, they were heroes, warriors, demigods of blood and sand. To the slaves below, they were labor, bodies to be dressed in armor, carried to lifts, tended when wounded, dragged back when dead. They were valuable property, and property had to be maintained. The crowd saw bravery, the hypogeum saw accounts. A gladiator was a number in a ledger, his life balanced against the cost of training and the thrill of applause. And what of our nameless man? He learned faces but not names. Names were luxuries. He knew the Thracian with the scar like a hook, the Myrmio with prayers on his lips, the boy with shoulders too narrow for the shield he carried. He knew them not as men, but as burdens he lifted, as corpses he carried. He knew their sweat and their silence, but not their voices. This was the truth Rome hid beneath its marble. The Colosseum was a monument not only to spectacle, but to forgetting. Every cheer was built on silence, every miracle on suffering, every gift on theft. The empire had perfected cruelty not by creating it, but by hiding it, by making death look like theater, by making slaves invisible, by making the people complicit. And as the sun set over the amphitheater, casting its arches in gold, the nameless ones below remained in darkness. They were the lungs of Rome, unseen, unpraised, indispensable. And yet, when the records were written, when poets sang, when emperors etched their triumphs in stone, not one word was given to the hands that made it possible. They were Rome's forgotten slaves, but their silence still whispers beneath the sand. To the citizen of Rome, the Colosseum was a miracle of engineering. They marveled at the way entire forests rose from beneath the sand, how wild beasts leapt through trapdoors as if vomited by the earth, how gladiators appeared from hidden gates like actors in a cosmic play. They believed the emperor's gift was divine, but miracles in Rome were never divine. They were mechanical, and they were fed with human suffering. Beneath the arena stretched the hypogeum, 2 levels of tunnels, chambers, cages, lifts, and pulleys. It was a labyrinth built not for living, but for labor and death. There, the forgotten slaves toiled in perpetual twilight, guided by the light of pitch torches that stung their lungs with smoke. Their world was wood and rope, iron and sweat. Every applause above was matched by a grunt below, every roar of the crowd by the hiss of rope against pulley. The hypogeum contained over 30 trapdoors, each linked to a vertical shaft that could haul men or beasts to the surface. The mechanism was simple in design, brutal in practice. Giant wooden elevators, powered by slaves chained to capstans, their shoulders digging into timber beams as they walked in endless circles. 30 men could lift a bear, 50 were needed for an elephant. The crowd saw a miracle. The men below felt only rope burns cutting deeper with each revolution. If the timing failed, if a beast rose too soon or too late, the illusion shattered, and the punishment fell on the slaves, not the overseers. The corridors smelled of rot. Animals from every corner of the empire were crammed into cages too small to turn in. Lions with ribs like knives, leopards pacing until their paws bled, crocodiles strapped in chains, elephants trembling under the whip. The slaves were their handlers, though never their masters. They jabbed the beasts with spears through the bars to keep them awake and enraged. They smeared blood on doors so that when the gates opened, the animals rushed forward into the arena. If the beasts turned against the slaves instead, no one above would know the difference. They would only hear the roar and cheer louder, believing it was all part of the show. Signals ran through the darkness. 1 thud of wood meant lift, 2 thuds, hold, 3 thuds, drop. Whistles called for hunters. Bells rang to drown the screams of men when beasts broke free in the tunnels. There was no language here, but sound. The slaves learned it quickly because mistakes meant death. Mourning belonged to Veneciones. The hunts were not real hunts. They were staged massacres. Tigers, bears, and lions released into the sand against unarmed men, or driven into each other until one beast fell. Hunters in polished armor delivered the final blow for the crowd's delight. But the true cruelty was backstage. Slaves spent nights starving the animals, pricking them with hot irons, forcing them to madness. The cruelty was necessary, the overseers said, because Rome demanded drama. Blood that came too quickly was boring. Blood that resisted, that screamed, that fought against death. That was entertainment. Midday was for executions, damnatio ad bestias. The condemned were dressed as mythological figures, props in a theater of horror. A man as Orpheus, playing lyre until lions tore him apart. A woman as Pasiphae, dragged into a mock wooden bull before fire consumed her. Sometimes children were thrown to the beasts, their deaths excused as allegories for ancient tales. The crowd ate their bread while watching. The emperor watched too, smiling because justice and spectacle shared the same face in Rome. And when the condemned fell, it was slaves who dragged the bodies away, raked sand over blood, and prepared for the next act. Afternoons were for gladiators. They entered from underground gates, armor gleaming, swords flashing. The crowd saw warriors. The slaves saw only weight to be hauled, wounds to be cleaned, corpses to be carried back. Gladiators were valuable, investments of their masters. Their worth was measured in survival, not humanity. Slaves carried their armor, patched their wounds, and when they died, disposed of them like broken tools. The crowd shouted names, Spiculus, Carpophorus, Commodus himself once, but the slaves below never spoke names. They spoke of the one with the scar, the one with the crooked leg, the one who laughed before he fell. The hypogum was a stage beneath the stage, a theater where no one applauded. Here, men gambled on how long a beast would take to kill a prisoner. Here, they whispered prayers not to gods, but to pulleys and ropes, hoping the machinery would hold one more time. Here, blood dried on walls never seen by daylight. The nameless man, the slave whose face could belong to anyone, learned to keep count. How many lifts before the shoulders broke? How many cries before a throat gave out? How many bodies one cart could carry before the axle snapped? He counted not for knowledge, but for survival, because numbers gave shape to madness. If he could measure it, he could endure it. But numbers lied. They did not stop the pain, or the memory of faces, or the certainty that tomorrow would bring the same work again. Above, the crowd roared. Below, the slaves whispered. The two worlds touched only through sound, the applause of citizens, the creak of ropes, the clash of cages. Rome had perfected cruelty by perfecting distance. The people could enjoy blood without smelling it. The emperor could call himself merciful, while thousands died in his gift. And the slaves, those who made the spectacle possible, were made invisible, buried in shadow, their voices swallowed by stone. The Colosseum was a miracle, yes, but every miracle requires a sacrifice. And in Rome, sacrifice always had a human face. The machinery of death kept turning, the ropes pulled, the doors opened, the sand drank, and the forgotten ones labored on, breathing for an empire that never learned their names. To stand in the hippodrome was to feel the heartbeat of cruelty. Above, the sun glared on marble. Below, the air clung heavy with mildew, iron, and fear. The Colosseum was no simple arena. It was a ritual machine, its gears made of men. Every day followed the same liturgy. Morning hunts, midday executions, afternoon duels. The audience believed themselves worshippers at a temple of spectacle. The slaves knew better. They were the altar boys of a god made from blood. The morning hunts, venations, were the first prayers. At dawn, the slaves herded beasts from cages, beasts dragged to Rome from the edges of empire, lions that once ruled African deserts, leopards from Anatolia, bears from alpine snows, elephants with eyes like grieving men. They had been starved for days, whipped until their hides blistered. The beasts did not understand Rome's demands. They only understood hunger, pain, and rage. And that was enough. The hypogum shuddered with movement as slaves pushed against wooden capstans, hauling animals onto platforms. With each creak, a trapdoor above swung open, and the crowd gasped at the miracle. The first lion rose into sunlight. It squinted, blinded by glare, then roared, a sound like thunder trapped in a chest. The arena shook with cheers, but for the slaves below, the roar was not awe. It was terror. They knew how thin the bars were, how quickly one mistake could send the beast downward instead of up. When that happened, and it did sometimes, the tunnels became the arena, and the nameless men became prey. The hunts were massacres, staged with the precision of theater. Hunters in glittering armor stabbed from horseback. Net throwers tangled paws. Spears pierced lungs. When the animals resisted too long, the crowd grew restless, demanding more blood. The overseers sent signals below. Agitate the cages, release another beast, drive the scene toward climax. In the tunnels, the slaves scrambled, dragging snarling leopards to the lifts, forcing them into death for a people who demanded variety and slaughter. By midday, the show darkened. Now it was not beasts against hunters, but beasts against men condemned by law. damnatio ad bestias. To Rome, this was justice made spectacle. To the slaves, it was a grotesque liturgy. The condemned were costumed as myths, Heracles fighting lions without his club, Orpheus charming nothing but claws, Icarus falling not from sky but from platform. The crowd laughed, mouths stuffed with bread, as men and women were torn apart in allegories they never asked to play. The slaves watched from cracks in the wooden floor above, through slats where blood dripped onto their faces. They saw eyes rolled back in agony, heard the snap of bone masked by trumpets, and still they worked, dragging corpses away, raking sand, covering crimson with pale grains so the next act could begin. Sometimes the condemned were not criminals but prisoners of war. Sometimes they were entire families. The empire called it cleansing, the crowd called it entertainment, the slaves called it nothing. There were no words left. The afternoon belonged to gladiators, Rome's heroes, Rome's lies. The crowd adored them, chanting names, waving hands. But the slaves knew the truth. Gladiators were property. Their bodies belonged to masters, their victories calculated like taxes. A Thracian with scars on his chest returned from combat bleeding. The crowd had showered him with flowers. In the tunnels, slaves carried him on a stretcher, slick with blood, petals stuck to his wounds like mockery. Gladiators were dressed in armor by slaves. They were armed, pushed to lifts, and sent up like offerings. When they returned alive, the slaves dressed their wounds. When they returned dead, the slaves dragged them to pits. There was no triumph, no fame underground, only labor. The nameless man, our witness, learned to recognize them not by names, but by the weight of their armor, by the sound of their footsteps on the planks. One man prayed before every fight, another laughed, another stared blankly as if already gone. And when they died, they all looked the same. Above, the emperor presided like a god. With a nod of his hand, men lived or died. The people cheered his mercy or roared at his cruelty. But below, the slaves saw something else. They saw the truth of Rome, that the lives of thousands dangled from a gesture. And that gesture was only possible because nameless backs bent to lift doors, to turn wheels, to haul cages. The theater of cruelty was not just for the audience, it was also for the slaves. Every day they witnessed what happened to those Rome deemed disposable. They knew their place was one step away from the sand. Today they turned the wheel. Tomorrow they might be the condemned, their deaths dressed as myth. Survival was not guaranteed, not even for the hands that built the miracle. At night, when the torches dimmed, the slaves whispered to each other. Some spoke of escape, others of revenge, others of gods who might still see them. One man swore he saw a senator slip beneath the stands and smear arena blood on his lips as blessing. Another swore the emperor himself once descended into the tunnels at midnight to listen in silence. "What did he hear?" the nameless man asked. "He heard us," came the answer. "He heard his empire breathing." And what is an empire but the sound of its slaves? The theater of cruelty ended each day not with applause, but with silence. The crowd departed, their hunger sated. The emperor returned to his palace. The sand, raked smooth again, hid its dead. Only the hypogeum still moved, slaves dragging carcasses of beasts, cleaning blood that no amount of sand could truly cover, preparing the stage for tomorrow's cruelty. Rome remembered the champions. Rome remembered the emperors. Rome remembered the architecture. But Rome never remembered the slaves. Their labor was too common, their suffering too ordinary, their deaths too cheap. And so, history, like the sand of the arena, covered them. Yet even sand remembers. Beneath the stones of the Colosseum, whispers still coil, the sound of rope, the scrape of cages, the breath of the nameless who made Rome's cruelty possible. When the arena emptied and twilight cloaked the stones in silence, the true toll of Rome's spectacle emerged. The Colosseum never truly slept. Beneath its weight, men groaned in shadows, chains scraped against stone, and blood refused to dry. The hypogeum was not just a workshop of cruelty. It was a slow-burning grave for those condemned to serve it. The nameless man, who had once been a shepherd in the green hills of Thrace, no longer remembered the sound of sheep bells. His ears were filled with roars, of beasts, of crowds, of dying men. Each night he collapsed on straw that reeked of sweat and mold, his muscles trembling from hauling gates and corpses. His back was a map of scars, traced by the lashes of overseers. Sleep brought no escape. Dreams replayed the horrors of the day. Eyes torn from sockets, jaws unhinged in screams, flesh shredded by claws, and he would wake screaming, his voice swallowed by the endless tunnels. The physical decay of the slaves was swift. Malnutrition hollowed their faces. Work bent their spines. Infection thrived in wounds left untreated. A cut from a rusted chain might swell into fever within days. Those who faltered were beaten, then discarded. In the tunnels, death was not an end but an inconvenience. Bodies dragged away, replaced by others. The machine of spectacle demanded replacements, and Rome had endless supply. Captives from wars, debtors sold by families, orphans swept from streets. But the greater collapse was not of flesh, but of spirit. To live in the Colosseum was to live in constant proximity to death, yet never as audience, never with choice. The slaves were condemned to be instruments of death, to grease the machinery of slaughter. Every time they lifted a gate, they delivered another soul to agony. Every time they raked the sand, they erased another life. And in erasing, they themselves were erased. The nameless man began to wonder, was he still human? Or had Rome remade him into an extension of wood, rope, and stone? He could no longer speak his own tongue. Months underground had drowned it. He spoke only in commands barked by overseers, in gestures shared among slaves. He realized he had no mirror. He no longer knew his own face. Worse still was the corruption of hope. Hope did not survive long in the hippodrome. The new arrivals, fresh captives, wide-eyed, still whispered of escape, of rebellion, of gods who might intervene. The older slaves, hollow-eyed and quiet, knew better. There is no beyond, one told him. There is only here. Rome has no outside. Rome is the world. Yet fragments of resistance lingered, fragile as candle flames. The slaves carved secret marks into stones, circles, hands, crude faces, small testaments that they had once lived, that they had once possessed names. A few shared stories of homelands, though each retelling grew shorter, blurred, until even memory bent to Rome's will. Sometimes in silence, the nameless man hummed a melody from Thrace, though he could no longer recall its words. He hummed it as a reminder that somewhere, once, life had been green and untainted by spectacle. But even resistance corroded. Some slaves began to take pride in efficiency, boasting of how quickly they cleaned blood, how smoothly they turned the lifts. The overseers rewarded such zeal with scraps of food, with fewer lashes. In this way, Rome not only enslaved bodies, but twisted souls, teaching them to measure worth by their service to cruelty. The nameless man felt the sickness of it, felt himself turning from victim into accomplice. The weight of that realization crushed him more than chains ever could. Above, the empire decayed in parallel. The Colosseum was a mirror of Rome itself, magnificent, brutal, fragile. The endless hunger for spectacle drained coffers. Armies strained to capture beasts from Africa, to drag prisoners from distant wars, to feed an audience that demanded novelty. Senators grumbled at the costs, but silenced themselves before the roar of the mob. For emperors, the Colosseum was both stage and trap. Grant enough blood, and you secured loyalty. Grant too little, and the people turned restless, their eyes sharp with suspicion. Rome's glory was parasitic. It fed on its slaves, on its beasts, on its conquered, but parasites that consume without restraint destroy even their host. Already whispers spread through the city. Shortages of animals, shortages of grain, shortages of men willing to fight. The spectacle consumed everything, and still demanded more. The nameless man once heard an overseer mutter, drunk with wine, that the Colosseum was cursed. "It eats us all," he said, laughing bitterly. "It eats the beasts, it eats the slaves, it eats the condemned, and in time, it will eat Rome itself." The man did not know he was overheard, but the words lodged in the slave's heart like a splinter of prophecy. As years passed, the nameless man felt his spirit collapsing, not with noise, but with silence. He no longer cried when beaten. He no longer flinched when blood splashed his face. He no longer dreamed of freedom. He became what Rome desired, invisible, tireless, hollow. He was still alive, but he was no longer living. He had become one of the forgotten, an anonymous gear in a theater that consumed souls. And yet, even as his spirit withered, he noticed something he could not explain. At night, when the moonlight filtered faintly through cracks, he sometimes felt the arena breathing. He felt the stones vibrating faintly, as if carrying the voices of all who had perished upon the sand. The Colosseum, he thought, remembers what men try to erase. The sand may cover blood, but the stones drink it. The crowd may forget names, but the ground does not. Perhaps in some way beyond words, the dead whispered still. The collapse of flesh and spirit was not just personal, it was collective. Slaves lost their names, their homelands, their gods. Rome lost its mercy, its restraint, its humanity. The Colosseum was supposed to be a monument to power. Instead, it became proof of corruption. The nameless man stood one night in the tunnels, his hand pressed against cold stone. He realized that even if Rome endured for centuries, its foundations would rot from within. Empires, like men, cannot consume forever. The Colosseum had taught him that. He did not know if he would live to see it, but he knew collapse always comes. Night in Rome was never silent, but deep inside the Colosseum, it was different. The outer streets echoed with tavern songs and the clatter of wagons. Yet in the Hippodrome, there grew another sound, a low hum, felt more than heard, like breath seeping from stone. The slaves said little of it aloud, for fear of mockery or lashings, but many had felt it. The sensation that the arena remembered, every drop of blood, every scream, every soul torn apart, seemed absorbed into the very bones of the structure. The nameless Thracian felt it most keenly in the hours after slaughter. When he pressed his ear to the walls, he sometimes thought he could hear voices, hundreds of them, layered, overlapping, murmuring in tongues he no longer recognized. At first he dismissed it as exhaustion, as madness born of darkness, but the more he listened, the more certain he became. The Colosseum was not merely stone, it was a vessel of memory. Whispers traveled among the slaves. One old man, a Greek captured long ago, claimed that the souls of the dead circled endlessly in the tunnels, unable to ascend to the gods. They lingered because their deaths had been spectacle, not sacrifice. The gods, he said, reject such endings. They do not honor a death meant for laughter. Another, a woman torn from Carthage, insisted that the beasts who died here returned as shadows, pacing the corridors, eyes glowing in moonlight. Some swore they had seen them. Superstition bred defiance. Before each performance, certain slaves would touch the same stone, an unremarkable block near the eastern tunnel, whispering hurried prayers to those who had perished before them. Others carved marks in the sand, quickly erased before overseers noticed. Small rituals, fragments of control in a life otherwise dictated by chains. The nameless man began to join them, though not with words. He pressed his hand against the cold stone before every show, and though he did not pray, he felt the roughness beneath his skin as a reminder. Others had touched this, others had lived, others had endured. It did not give him hope exactly, but it gave him solidarity, a sense that he was not utterly alone. Even forgotten voices could still echo. Above, the spectators sensed none of this. To them, the Colosseum was pure theater, triumph carved in stone, a palace of blood for the glory of Rome. They did not know that beneath their feet, the foundation groaned with the weight of unremembered lives. They cheered for heroes, for emperors, for the spectacle itself, never realizing that every cry of victory was built upon layers of suffering unseen. Sometimes, however, the voices refused to remain hidden. Strange accidents occurred, trapdoors that opened at the wrong time, lifts that collapsed suddenly, gates that stuck fast as if held by invisible hands. Overseers blamed incompetence, punished slaves mercilessly, but some whispered it was the dead themselves interfering. Rome laughed at such tales, dismissing them as fear. Yet in the tunnels, the whispers carried weight. The forgotten had not vanished. They lingered, restless. The Thracian slave began to dream vividly. In one vision, he saw the Colosseum flooded not with blood, but with water. The sand washed clean, the crowd silent. From beneath the surface, pale faces looked up, their eyes open, their mouths moving without sound. He woke drenched in sweat, but the image clung to him. The dead were still there, pressing upward, demanding remembrance. Even his overseer, a cruel man hardened by years of violence, once muttered drunkenly, "This place speaks at night." His laughter was hollow, eyes darting to the shadows. For all their brutality, even Rome's keepers could not wholly silence the feeling that the Colosseum was haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory itself, etched too deep to erase. In time, the Thracian came to understand that this echo was both curse and warning. Curse, because it trapped souls in endless unrest. Warning, because it whispered of Rome's own fate. An empire that built its joy upon erasing lives could not escape the echo of those lives. No matter how loud the cheers, silence would one day fall. And in that silence, only the whispers of the forgotten would remain. One evening, as he hauled a broken cart through the tunnels, the Thracian paused. He set his torch against the wall, watching shadows dance. Then, in the wavering light, he traced the outline of his hand upon the stone with soot. A mark so small, it would fade in days. Yet to him, it was everything. A testimony that he had been, a refusal to vanish entirely. He wondered then, centuries from now, when Rome was dust, would someone else find this mark? Would they wonder whose hand had made it? Would they sense the voices still echoing? He did not know. But the thought sustained him more than food or water ever could. The Colosseum devoured men, but it could not wholly silence them. Their voices lingered, carried in stone, in whispers, in shadows. Forgotten by Rome, remembered by eternity. And so, in the echo of forgotten voices, the slaves of the Colosseum endured, not free, not alive in the true sense, but unyielding in the only way left to them. They could not defeat Rome, but they could haunt it. Rome was an empire of contradictions, order and chaos, law and savagery, glory and ruin. Nowhere was this duality more visible than in the Colosseum. To the Roman people, it was a gift from their emperors, a symbol of power and stability. To the slaves beneath, it was a grinding machine, designed not merely to entertain, but to control, to pacify, and to remind everyone who held the reins of fate. The phrase spread through the streets. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Feed the people, dazzle their eyes, and they will forget hunger, injustice, even tyranny. Every aspect of the Colosseum was engineered to this purpose. The vast stone arches and tiered seating did not only showcase wealth, they orchestrated hierarchy. Senators reclined in the best seats, shielded from the sun by silken awnings, while the poor crammed into the upper rows. It was a theater of class as much as violence, reinforcing Rome's order with every event. And who maintained this illusion? Slaves. Thousands of nameless workers ensuring that the grand machine ran flawlessly, even as it consumed them. The Thracian slave, dragging ropes that bit into his shoulders, began to understand the cruel genius of it all. The Colosseum was not simply about killing, it was about reminding the crowd who had power over life and death. Every beast loosed into the arena, every prisoner slain, was a message. Rome is eternal. Rome is supreme. Rome decides. For the masses, it was intoxicating. For the slaves, it was suffocation. They were cogs in a wheel that would never stop turning. Some controlled the elevators that hoisted cages filled with lions. Others poured buckets of water to wash away blood, their hands raw from lime and ash. Others drilled holes into dead animals' hides, stuffing them with straw to be paraded as trophies. And still others, like the Thracian, dragged broken corpses into the tunnels, stacking them like firewood before they were carted away. Each task was brutal, but what crushed the soul most was the knowledge that none of it mattered. Today's spectacle vanished into tomorrow's. The sand was raked, the blood absorbed, the crowd appeased. The empire rolled on. The slaves were invisible, their existence erased the moment the crowd's hunger was fed. Occasionally, the overseers reminded them explicitly, "You are not men," one barked. "You are tools." And indeed, the Colosseum treated them as such, tools of labor, tools of terror, tools of memory erased. Yet tools can break. Tools can resist in small, unseen ways. The Thracian witnessed one such act. A fellow slave, a Numidian boy no older than 15, was ordered to release a starving bear into the arena. Instead, trembling, he loosened the chain too slowly, buying a condemned gladiator precious seconds to prepare. The gladiator fought with a ferocity that astonished the crowd, slaying the beast before it mauled him. The boy was beaten senseless afterward, but among the slaves, his name passed in whispers, a spark of rebellion. Even the smallest hesitation in the machinery could ripple outward. But Rome's genius lay not only in violence, it lay in spectacle. The emperors understood that the Colosseum was their most potent weapon, not against enemies, but against their own restless citizens. Bread was distributed freely on festival days, ensuring bellies were full. Then the games began, and with them, the intoxicating flood of blood. What man would question politics when his mouth tasted grain and his eyes feasted on death? The slaves saw the truth more clearly than anyone. They were the hidden gears, grinding behind the curtain, their sweat fueling the illusion. When the crowd roared, it was not for them. When emperors raised their hands, it was not for mercy. It was to remind the people that Rome could give life or snatch it away in an instant. The Colosseum was less an amphitheater than a cathedral of control. Yet even cathedrals crack. Beneath the stone, the slaves whispered of the weight pressing upon Rome's soul. "One day," murmured the Greek elder, "the crowd will hunger for more than bread, more than blood. And when that day comes, these stones will crumble." The Thracian listened but dared not believe. Rome seemed too vast, too eternal. Still, the whispers lingered. He thought of the machinery in which he was trapped, the endless repetition of slaughter, cleanup, preparation. It was a cycle that consumed lives endlessly. And he wondered, perhaps this was Rome itself. Not a city, not a people, but a mechanism designed to devour and display. Devour and display. And if so, what would happen when there was nothing left to devour? One night, after the games ended, he wandered briefly into the arena. The sand was dark, still wet in patches, reeking of iron. He crouched, running his fingers through the grit. How many lives had been spilled here? Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? He scooped a handful, letting it slip between his fingers. Sand that had drunk so much blood that it no longer seemed like earth, but something else entirely, an artifact of human cruelty. In that moment, he realized the Colosseum was not just a machine for the living, it was also a graveyard for the forgotten. Each grain of sand was a reliquary, carrying fragments of lives erased. The machinery of Rome did not merely kill, it absorbed, it consumed, it erased. And as he rose, the faintest echo seemed to murmur beneath his feet. Not a ghost's voice, but the grinding of the machine itself, insatiable, unstoppable. He understood then that he was no longer merely trapped in chains of iron. He was trapped in chains of history, bound to a cycle that might outlast his very bones. But he also knew, no machine runs forever. Even the greatest empire must one day falter. Even Rome's bread and circuses would rot. And when that day came, perhaps the voices of the forgotten would finally rise louder than the cheers of the crowd. The Colosseum was built as a monument to eternity, yet everything within it spoke of impermanence. The bodies rotted, the beasts died, the slaves withered. Even the emperors who sat in gilded seats adored by thousands were often gone within a decade, claimed by poison, conspiracy, or the sword. The Thracian slave came to see this truth etched in every corner. The Colosseum promised permanence, but it devoured both flesh and empire alike. The toll on the slaves' bodies was merciless. Their shoulders knotted into twisted ropes of muscle and scar tissue. Their skin cracked from lime, ash, and sun. Feet bled endlessly on stone floors. Some collapsed mid-task, dragged away like refuse, their names unspoken, their absence unnoticed. They were tools until tools broke, and when tools broke, they were discarded. The Thracian watched companions vanish one by one. The Numidian boy who had once dared to slow the chain of a bear disappeared after another defiance, perhaps executed quietly. The Greek elder who spoke of Rome's eventual fall was found lifeless in the tunnels, face pressed into the sand he had so often cleaned. To the empire, their deaths meant nothing. To the slave who survived, each loss was another stone pressing upon his chest. But it was not only the slaves who frayed. Even the grand illusion of Rome began to show cracks. Spectacle demanded more and more. The people had grown accustomed to lions and leopards, to men fighting men. They demanded novelty. Crocodiles dragged from the Nile, giraffes paraded before slaughter, even staged sea battles where the arena was flooded to mimic the ocean. The cost was astronomical. Rome's coffers bled as surely as the gladiators did. And still the emperors indulged, for fear of losing the crowd's loyalty. Bread and circuses had become not a tool, but a shackle. The empire itself was enslaved to the hunger it had created. Every festival was larger than the last. Every death grander. Every show more grotesque. Behind the marvel, however, was rot. The empire strained to maintain its image of power while cracks spidered beneath the marble. Disease crept into the Colosseum too. Blood was not simply spilled. It lingered, soaked into the sand, carried in droplets into the tunnels. Infected wounds festered. Fevers spread among slaves packed in stinking quarters. Some whispered that even the crowd was not immune, that the stench of death wafted up to poison the breath of senators and commoners alike. The Colosseum, once a temple of glory, became a breeding ground for decay. The Thracian could not help but notice the shift in the crowd. Their cheers had grown harsher, more desperate. No longer was it mere excitement. It was hunger edged with madness. Men bellowed for blood, not with joy, but with a strange emptiness in their eyes. Women leaned forward with feverish smiles, as if the suffering below fed some void in their souls. The more Rome tried to satisfy them, the deeper their hunger grew. And within the arena itself, the violence became more senseless. Where once condemned criminals or prisoners of war were pitted against beasts, now slaves, mere workers from the tunnels, were thrown in when the supply ran thin. Sometimes it was done to punish, sometimes simply to amuse. The Thracian lived each day with the dread that his turn would come, that his backbreaking labor would end not in exhaustion, but in spectacle. He began to notice how even the architecture seemed to groan beneath the strain. Stones cracked under the weight of decades of feet. Wooden beams rotted in the damp air of the hippodrome. Torches left black scars on walls that once gleamed. What was built to last eternity was already aging, already faltering. The Colosseum was a mirror of Rome itself. Mighty, yes, but gnawed from within. One night, while clearing refuse in the tunnels, he overheard two overseers speaking in hushed Latin. They spoke of rising costs, of shortages of exotic animals, of provinces rebelling at the weight of taxes. "The empire stretches too thin," one muttered. "We bleed everywhere, but still the people demand more games." The other only spat and said, "Then we give them more, until nothing is left." The words clung to the Thracian like a chill. Rome itself was enslaved to its machine. And yet, through all this decay, the machinery still ground on. The festivals continued, the crowds gathered, the emperors raised their hands. But to the slaves in the tunnels, each day felt more like a death march. They were trapped not only in chains, but in a cycle that dragged everything, man, beast, empire, toward collapse. The Thracian began to dream, not of freedom, but of silence. He imagined the Colosseum empty, its seats vacant, its sands unstained, its tunnels quiet. The thought was so alien it felt like blasphemy. Could there ever be a day without blood, without cheering, without death echoing down the corridors? He could not picture it fully, but the longing grew like a hidden ember. Sometimes, when he stood beneath the arena floor, he pressed his hands against the stones. They vibrated faintly, not from ghosts, but from the weight of thousands above. And he thought, Rome is crumbling, but we are buried so deep, no one will hear when it falls. We will be forgotten before the walls even crack. The collapse had already begun, not in stone, but in flesh, in spirit, in the empire's soul. The Colosseum was not simply Rome's glory, it was Rome's hunger, Rome's sickness, Rome's undoing. The slaves knew this truth intimately. They carried it in their bones, in their bleeding feet, in their silent despair. The empire demanded endless sacrifice, but nothing. No empire, no machine, no god of stone and sand can feast forever. And somewhere in the silence between games, when the torches guttered low, the Thracian thought he heard it. Not the roar of the crowd, not the rumble of beasts, but the faint cracking of marble, the whisper of eternity faltering, the first sigh of collapse. The Colosseum once shook with a sound like thunder, the cheers of 50,000 throats demanding blood. But centuries have a way of softening even the loudest echoes. Time is patient. Time waits for stone to crack, for empires to fall, for voices to fade. The roar that once defined Rome would one day dissolve into silence, and in that silence, only whispers of the forgotten remained. For the Thracian slave, the passing years became indistinguishable. Day blurred into night, festival into festival, blood into blood. His body aged in the dark, his back bending beneath invisible weights. His skin hardened like leather, and the lines on his face deepened, until he scarcely recognized his reflection in a bucket of water. He was not the boy who had first stepped into the Colosseum's tunnels. He was not even a man. He was something else, a shadow of himself, molded by stone, by sand, by chains. And yet even he could sense change. Rome itself was shifting. Emperors came and went with dizzying speed. Civil wars erupted. Plague spread. The city, once swollen with wealth and conquest, began to groan beneath the weight of its own excess. There were fewer festivals now, fewer exotic beasts shipped from far provinces, fewer gladiators paraded like heroes. The Colosseum, though still vast and terrible, began to feel tired. The Thracian noticed the cracks first in the crowd. Seats once filled with eager citizens stood half empty. Applause grew weaker. Murmurs of discontent traveled more swiftly than cheers. The people still craved distraction, but the empire had less to give. Bread grew scarce, and even circuses could no longer mask hunger. The Colosseum, that great furnace of blood, was slowly running out of fuel. Then came the storms. Rome's enemies pressed harder at the borders. Barbarian tribes, once dismissed as savages, surged with unexpected strength. Armies stretched thin, could no longer defend all frontiers. Provinces broke away. And as Rome shrank, so too did the flow of wealth, of slaves, of spectacle. The empire's veins no longer pumped life into the Colosseum. There were nights when no games were held at all. The tunnels stood empty, torches unlit, silence reigning where chaos once thundered. The Thracian, by now gray and slow, would sit in the shadows and simply listen. For the first time in his life, he heard the Colosseum breathe. Wind whispered across abandoned seats. Moonlight traced the outlines of arches once illuminated by flame. The great machine was sleeping, and perhaps, he thought, it might never wake again. He lived long enough to witness what many slaves had only dreamed of. The Colosseum in decline. Walls crumbled. Vines crept up the stone. Rain pooled in cracks. The very earth began to reclaim what Rome had forced upon it. Where lions once leapt, weeds now sprouted. Where emperors raised their hands, birds nested in marble niches. The gods of sand and blood were not immortal after all. But if the Colosseum died, what of its slaves? Their names were never carved into stone. No plaques remembered them. No songs were sung of their toil. They vanished as if they had never existed, their bones mingling with the dust beneath the arena floor. Even the Thracian, whose memories had burned so fiercely, became only another shadow swallowed by silence. His story, like thousands of others, was erased, forgotten not by cruelty alone, but by indifference. And yet, there is a strange defiance in that silence. For while Rome had sought to immortalize itself through the Colosseum, the stone betrayed the empire. Today the Colosseum still stands, scarred and broken, but enduring. Tourists marvel at its arches. Scholars speak of its architecture. Few pause to wonder who built it, who bled beneath it, who perished unnamed in its depths. But the stone remembers. The silence remembers. Perhaps that is the cruelest irony. Rome's emperors, senators, and generals are written in books, carved in marble, their legacies debated endlessly. But the Colosseum, Rome's mightiest monument, was carried on the backs of those whose names are gone. It endures not as a shrine to glory, but as a tomb to the forgotten. If one listens closely, walking its corridors today, one might still sense them. The slaves who hauled stone, who chained beasts, who dragged corpses, who kept the great machine alive. Their voices are not in the history books, but in the cracks of the walls, in the faint smell of iron in the earth, in the silence that falls when crowds leave, and only the shadow of eternity remains. The Thracian never escaped. He never held freedom in his hands. But perhaps, in his final days, he felt something even stranger. The collapse of the very thing that had enslaved him. He lived to see silence fall upon the Colosseum, and in that silence, there was a kind of freedom no emperor could steal. The Colosseum endures, Rome fell, the slaves are forgotten. But perhaps it is the forgotten who haunt the stone most powerfully. For while the emperors wanted immortality, it is the slaves, their sweat, their blood, their silence, that truly bind the Colosseum to history. And so the story ends not with roar, but with silence. A silence that speaks louder than any crowd, heavier than any chain, the silence of the forgotten, echoing forever in the ruins of Rome. The Colosseum still stands, weathered by centuries, a broken crown upon the head of a fallen empire. Millions visit its arches each year, gazing in awe at its grandeur, its scale, its survival. But few pause to ask the questions that matter most. Who carved these stones? Who carried them? Who gave their blood to keep this beast alive? Rome remembered its emperors. Rome remembered its generals. Rome remembered its victories, but Rome forgot the ones who bore its weight, the nameless slaves, the faceless workers, the silent shadows. They were erased from the story, swallowed by the hunger of an empire that cared only for spectacle. And yet, their presence lingers. You can feel them in the silence that falls when the crowds disperse. You can see them in the cracks where weeds grow, reclaiming what was once theirs. You can almost hear them in the wind that moves through the arches, whispering of chains, of screams, of forgotten lives. Perhaps this is the greatest irony, that the Colosseum, built as a monument to Roman glory, now stands as a monument to the forgotten. The emperors who demanded its construction are dust. The crowds who once filled its seats are gone. But the silence of the slaves, their absence, their erasure, is what endures. And so we are left with a question. When we walk among ruins, whose voices do we choose to hear? Do we listen only to the conquerors, the rulers, the victors? Or do we allow ourselves to hear the whispers of the forgotten, the ones whose hands, whose backs, whose blood truly built history? Because in the end, history is not just about power, it is about memory. And when we forget those who were made to suffer, we lose not only their story, we lose our own humanity. So, the next time you stand before the Colosseum, remember this. The stone is silent, but the silence speaks. It tells us of men and women who lived, labored, and died without names, without honor, without remembrance. They are the true ghosts of Rome, and perhaps by remembering them now, we can give them the immortality they were denied. The roar has ended. The empire has fallen. All that remains is silence. And in that silence, the forgotten slaves of the Colosseum endure.